They laughed at me in that meeting room. Not quietly, not politely, they laughed out loud. It wasn't the nervous kind of laughter people use to hide uncertainty. This was confident laughter, comfortable laughter, the kind that comes from people who believe they hold all the power and don't expect to be challenged. The HOA board members leaned back in their leather chairs as if they were settling in to watch a show. One crossed his arms, another casually checked his phone. The president, a man who never missed a chance to remind everyone how valuable his time was, tapped his pen against a thick binder and shook his head with a grin. "A private flood wall?" he said, dragging the words out. "Seriously? This isn't a bunker movie." A few of them chuckled again. One woman covered her mouth, pretending to suppress a laugh while still enjoying every second of it. Someone at the far end of the table whispered something I couldn't hear, followed by another burst of amusement. I stood alone at the end of the table, hands resting calmly in front of me, listening. I wasn't angry, not yet. I had already learned something important about this board. They didn't laugh because the idea was ridiculous. They laughed because it threatened their sense of authority, because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't thought of everything. That was unacceptable to them. The meeting room itself was designed to intimidate. Long, polished table, framed certificates on the walls, a printed mission statement about community harmony hanging crookedly behind the president's chair. The air conditioning was set just a little too cold, as if discomfort were part of the strategy. I had been called there because of my flood wall, not because it violated any real safety code, not because it blocked access or endangered anyone, but because it existed, because I built it without waiting for their blessing. For months, I had sent emails warning them about the river, calm emails, professional emails, emails with charts, rainfall data, drainage capacity calculations, and historical flood comparisons. I explained how recent storms were different, how the soil saturation levels were higher, how the aging drainage system was already operating near failure. They replied with boilerplate language. "Thank you for your concern. Our consultants assure us the situation is under control. We will revisit this in the next fiscal review." Translation, not now, not ever. So I took responsibility for my own property. I pulled permits. I followed local regulations. I hired licensed contractors. I paid for everything myself. The flood wall wasn't massive or dramatic, just 3 feet high, reinforced concrete, anchored deep below ground level, hidden behind landscaping so it wouldn't stand out or offend anyone's sense of aesthetics. But the HOA noticed anyway. They always do. According to them, the wall sent the wrong message. It created unnecessary fear. It undermined confidence in the association's management. That last part was the real problem. They didn't like that I had acted independently. They didn't like that my wall quietly suggested that their assurances might not be enough. And they definitely didn't like that other homeowners had started asking questions. So they fined me. And when I appealed the fine, they called this meeting. That's why I was standing there now, watching them laugh. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself again. I had already said everything that needed to be said. I had explained the data. I had warned them of the risk. Repeating it wouldn't change anything. The president leaned forward, clasping his hands together like a judge ready to deliver a verdict. "Look," he said, smiling thinly, "if the river floods, it floods all of us. You can't just build a little wall and pretend you're smarter than nature or smarter than us." The room hummed with agreement. I nodded once, because while they were laughing, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't pull it out right away. I already knew what it was. I had set alerts weeks ago. Rainfall thresholds, river level sensors, emergency notifications. But the vibration kept going, again and again. Finally, I took the phone out and glanced down. Flash flood warning. Immediate action advised. I looked back up at the table. None of them noticed. They were still enjoying themselves, still riding the momentum of their own confidence. Someone on the board made a joke about sandbags. Another joked about selling me a life raft. Laughter rippled around the room one more time. That was the moment, the exact moment, when the rain started hitting the building hard enough to be heard. At first, it sounded nothing more than heavy drops against glass, easy to ignore, familiar, comfortable. But within seconds, it intensified. The soft tapping turned into a constant roar, like gravel being poured from the sky. A few heads turned toward the windows. Still no concern. Storms happened all the time. The president cleared his throat and began summarizing the fine again, already moving to his next appointment. That's when a distant siren cut through the rain, then another and another. Phones around the table started lighting up. Someone shrugged at their screen. Another shifted in their chair. The laughter faded, replaced by confusion. I said nothing, because I knew something they didn't. Less than 20 minutes later, those same people would be screaming into their phones while water poured through the doors of the very building they controlled. Their office sat lower than the surrounding streets. Their drainage system was outdated. Their maintenance requests had been deferred year after year to keep dues competitive. They trusted appearances instead of preparation. I trusted physics. As the rain intensified and the sirens grew closer, the power dynamic in that room began to shift, subtly at first, then all at once. The joke was over, and it all started because I refused to trust them with my home.
Our neighborhood sat next to a river that had been stable for decades, according to the HOA newsletters. Every spring, like clockwork, the emails arrived. Bright subject lines, reassuring language, carefully chosen phrases meant to calm, not inform. The river remains within safe levels. Our drainage systems are more than sufficient. There is no cause for concern. Most people accepted that without question. Why wouldn't they? The river had always been there, quietly winding past the neighborhood like a harmless feature on a postcard. Kids rode bikes along it. Joggers waved to each other in the mornings. Real estate listings even advertised it as a peaceful, natural boundary. But I wasn't reading those newsletters the way everyone else was, because I'm a civil engineer, and engineers don't deal in comfort. We deal in failure points. I don't trust newsletters. I trust data. Data doesn't care about tradition. It doesn't care how things used to behave. Data only cares about what's changing and what happens when people ignore those changes. And the data was screaming. Rainfall patterns weren't just increasing, they were becoming erratic. Storms were dumping more water in shorter periods of time. What used to fall over 3 days was now coming down in 6 hours. That kind of shift overwhelmed systems designed for a different era. The banks were eroding faster than anyone admitted, not dramatic collapses, subtle losses, inches at a time, the kind of erosion that doesn't make headlines but quietly eats away at stability. Storm surges were lasting longer too. Water levels weren't just spiking, they were staying elevated. That meant saturated soil, weakened foundations, drainage systems with nowhere left to send excess water. I ran the numbers again and again, and every model pointed to the same conclusion. It wasn't a matter of if the river would overwhelm the neighborhood, it was a matter of when. So I warned them. At first, I did it politely. I sent an email outlining my concerns, attaching rainfall data and recent hydrology reports. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't make demands. I simply suggested that the HOA commission an updated flood risk assessment. The response came a week later. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Our consultants have assured us that existing infrastructure meets current needs. That word, consultants, kept appearing. Always unnamed, always unquestionable. So I escalated. I sent a second email with diagrams, visuals showing how runoff had changed, how the drainage capacity was now operating dangerously close to maximum during peak storms. I even highlighted specific culverts and channels that needed reinforcement. This time, the reply was shorter. We appreciate your concern. At this time, no action is planned. Months passed. Another storm came, then another. Streets flooded briefly before draining. People shrugged it off. Someone joked in the community forum that the neighborhood was getting waterfront perks. I sent another message. This one included projections, not worst-case scenarios, realistic ones. I explained how a single severe storm, under the right conditions, could push the system beyond its limits. I emphasized that proactive upgrades would cost far less than emergency repairs later. That email didn't get a response at all. That's when I realized the real issue. Fixing infrastructure would mean dipping into reserves, and reserves to an HOA board are sacred. They're bragging rights. They're proof of good management. Spending them, especially on something that hasn't failed yet, would look bad on paper. So they chose optimism instead. 2 years went by like this. 2 years of warnings, 2 years of silence, 2 years of polite dismissal wrapped in cheerful newsletters. Meanwhile, I kept watching the river. I watched how fast it rose after storms. I watched where water pooled first. I noticed which sections of ground stayed damp days longer than they should have. I noted how debris accumulated near drainage inlets that were supposedly clear. I wasn't panicking. I was preparing. And eventually, I accepted a hard truth. The HOA was never going to act until something broke. And when it did, they would act too late. So I did the only thing I could. I protected my own property. Not emotionally, not symbolically, practically. I reviewed local codes. I checked setback requirements. I made sure everything I planned was legal, documented, and defensible. I hired professionals who understood flood mitigation, not aesthetics. The wall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to be. 3 feet of reinforced concrete, steel rebar, deep footings designed to redirect flow, not stop a tsunami. Built to buy time, those critical minutes and hours that make the difference between water reaching a foundation and water being held back. I concealed it with landscaping because I didn't want attention. I didn't want conflict. I wanted security. But security itself became the problem. Neighbors noticed. Questions started circulating. Someone mentioned my wall in the community chat. Someone else asked why I thought it was necessary. And suddenly, the HOA noticed too. They didn't come to ask what I knew. They didn't ask to see the data. They called it fear-based. They called it unnecessary. They called it disruptive. Because if I was right, then they had been wrong for years, and admitting that would cost more than money. So they fined me. They summoned me. They laughed. What they never understood was this. I didn't build the wall because I wanted to be right. I built it because I knew with absolute certainty that when the water came, newsletters wouldn't stop it, and neither would their confidence.
I applied for permits. I followed local codes. I paid out of pocket. That part never seemed to matter to them. Before a single shovel touched the ground, I did everything by the book. I checked zoning regulations, I reviewed setback requirements, I filed applications, waded through review periods, and answered follow-up questions from the city. Inspectors came out, walked the property, and signed off. Every step was documented, stamped, approved. There was nothing secret about it, there was nothing illegal about it, and there was nothing reckless about it either. The wall itself was simple, because simple works. Reinforced concrete, 3 feet high, with steel rebar running through it like a skeleton. The foundation was anchored deep, far deeper than what was visible above ground, because flood protection isn't about height, it's about resistance. Pressure always finds the weakest point. I designed it to redirect water, not challenge it. Angled returns, proper drainage paths, relief points so pressure wouldn't build up behind it. Everything calculated, tested, and verified. Then I hid it. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I knew exactly how the HOA thought. If it stood out, they would turn it into a spectacle. So I wrapped it in landscaping, raised beds, shrubs, stone accents. From the street, it looked like a tasteful design choice, not a defensive structure. I made sure it didn't ruin the aesthetic. Ironically, that's what made them furious. The HOA hated it, not immediately. At first, it was quiet. A few sideways glances, a couple of neighbors asking casual questions that sounded rehearsed. Someone from the architectural committee drove past my house twice in one afternoon, slowing down both times. Then the emails started. They said the wall made the neighborhood look paranoid. They said it created an atmosphere of fear, as if concrete could somehow infect people with anxiety. They said it sent the wrong message to potential buyers, as if pretending risk didn't exist was better marketing than preparation. And finally, they said the quiet part out loud. They said it implied they weren't doing their job. That was the real offense. The wall didn't just protect my property, it challenged their narrative. It stood there, silent, unbothered, suggesting that maybe the HOA's constant reassurance wasn't enough, that maybe individual homeowners needed to take matters into their own hands. And HOAs hate nothing more than independence. I responded to every complaint calmly. I attached permit approvals. I referenced code sections. I explained again that the structure was fully compliant and posed no risk to anyone else. None of that mattered. They weren't looking for clarification. They were looking for control. So they switched tactics. Instead of arguing about safety, they reframed the issue as a community standards violation. They claimed the wall was out of character. They questioned whether it aligned with the spirit of the neighborhood. That word spirit gets used a lot when the law isn't on their side. Then came the fine. Not enormous, but symbolic, a message, a reminder of who they believed was in charge. I paid it without protest, not because I agreed, but because I knew where this was heading. Power struggles always escalate. Within a week, I received a formal notice, mandatory appearance, HOA board meeting, attendance required. The tone was different this time. No friendly language, no polite phrasing, just authority, bolded and underlined. They wanted me in that room. They wanted witnesses. They wanted to put me in my place. What they didn't understand was that I had already made peace with their disapproval. The wall was finished. The permits were approved. The structure was legal. There was nothing they could force me to undo without exposing themselves to liability. So the meeting wasn't about resolution. It was about humiliation. They wanted to make an example out of me, to show the rest of the neighborhood what happens when someone steps outside the HOA's carefully managed reality. As I prepared for the meeting, I gathered everything: printed emails, permit copies, inspection reports, engineering drawings. Not because I expected them to listen, but because documentation has a way of becoming useful later. I walked into that building knowing exactly how it would go. They would dismiss me, they would minimize the risk, they would frame the wall as unnecessary and dramatic, and they would do it with smiles, because from their perspective, they still had the upper hand. The river hadn't flooded yet, the system hadn't failed yet, nothing had gone wrong yet. To them, my wall was a problem that existed in the present. The flood was a hypothetical future inconvenience. They chose to fight what they could see. I chose to prepare for what I knew was coming. That difference between image and reality, between authority and competence, was about to matter more than any of them realized. Because the meeting they summoned me to wasn't just about a wall. It was the last moment they had to take the warning seriously. And they chose laughter instead.
The HOA president actually chuckled when I explained the wall. Not a polite chuckle, not the kind meant to soften disagreement. This was a dismissive sound, the kind people make when they believe the conversation is already over. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands across his stomach, and looked around the table as if inviting the others to enjoy the moment with him. "If the river floods," he said, smiling, "we all flood together. You can't outsmart nature with a little wall." A ripple of agreement followed. Heads nodded. Someone smirked. Someone else let out a short laugh like punctuation. I noticed how comfortable they all looked. The confidence in the room was thick, almost tangible. Leather chairs, bottled water untouched, papers neatly stacked in front of people who hadn't read them. Another board member leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You're not special," he said flatly, "and you're definitely not smarter than our consultants." That word again, consultants, still unnamed, still unquestioned, still treated like an invisible authority that conveniently agreed with whatever the board already wanted to believe. I glanced down the table. 7 people, 7 votes. None of them had engineering backgrounds. None of them had run models or studied hydrology, but all of them were certain. Certainty is seductive like that. They talked over one another for a few minutes, reframing the issue so it no longer had anything to do with safety or data. Now it was about tone, about perception, about community cohesion. Someone said the wall made people nervous. Someone said it looked like I was preparing for disaster. Someone said preparation itself was the problem. I stood there quietly, hands relaxed, listening to them redefine reality in real time. Finally, the president cleared his throat and brought the discussion to a close. The board has decided, he announced, that this structure constitutes unauthorized fear-based construction. Fear-based, as if fear were a violation, as if ignoring risk were a virtue. They voted right there, no hesitation, no abstentions, a unanimous show of hands. The fine wasn't devastating. It was never meant to be. It was symbolic, a public reminder that they had the authority to punish non-compliance, even when compliance had already been achieved. The president slid the paper across the table toward me. I looked at it. Then I looked up at him. And I smiled. Not sarcastically, not smugly, just calmly. That confused him more than anger would have. I thanked them for their time. I told them I understood their position. I said I would pay the fine promptly. A few of them looked disappointed. They wanted resistance. They wanted an argument. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me push back and be shut down. Instead, I took the paper, nodded once, and stepped back from the table. That's when my phone buzzed. At first, it was subtle, a vibration against my palm. I ignored it. Phones go off all the time. Meetings continue. Then it buzzed again, longer this time. I didn't pull it out yet. I didn't want to interrupt their victory lap. They were already shifting in their seats, mentally moving on to the next agenda item. The president tapped his pen again, ready to adjourn. The phone buzzed a third time, persistent, urgent. I glanced down. Flash flood warning, issued by the county emergency system, effective immediately. I didn't announce it. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked back up at the table. They were still smiling, still confident, still unaware that the assumptions they had just voted on were already collapsing. Rain began to drum harder against the windows. It wasn't dramatic yet, just noticeable, the kind of sound people subconsciously register without assigning meaning to. One board member frowned and glanced toward the glass. Another checked his phone, then another. A low murmur spread across the table as screens lit up one by one. The president noticed the shift in attention and frowned. "Is there a problem?" No one answered immediately. Someone said, "I just got an alert." Someone else said, "Same here." The room felt different now. The air wasn't cold anymore. It was tight, pressurized. I stood exactly where I was. The rain intensified, transforming from background noise into a steady roar. Water streaked down the windows in thick, uneven lines. A distant siren cut through the sound, then another. The president checked his phone at last. His smile disappeared. "What does it say?" asked someone. He didn't answer right away. He read, scrolled, read again. His face changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The confidence drained out of it, replaced with calculation. "Apparently," he said slowly, "the river is rising faster than predicted." That word predicted hung in the air. One of the board members laughed nervously. "It always does that. It'll pass." Another siren wailed, closer this time. Someone stood up and walked to the window. "Oh," he said quietly. The meeting room fell silent. I finally spoke. "May I?" I asked, holding up my phone. No one objected. I read the alert aloud, the projected rainfall totals, the overflow risk, the advisory for low-lying structures. Like their office, like their storage rooms, like their server closet in the basement. Chairs scraped across the floor as people stood up at once. The president's pen rolled off the table and clattered to the ground, unnoticed.
Phones were pressed to ears, voices rose. Someone asked if sandbags were available. Someone else asked about shutting down power. The vote they had just taken, so confident, so final, suddenly felt irrelevant. I tucked my phone back into my pocket. The fine didn't matter anymore. Neither did their laughter, because while they had been debating perception, nature had been doing what nature always does, following physics. And the wall they mocked, it was already doing its job.
The storm hit fast. Not the slow, building kind that gives you time to prepare. This one arrived like a switch being flipped. One moment the air was heavy and still, and the next, rain was slamming down with a force that felt intentional. Rain hammered the area harder than forecasts predicted. Sheets of it fell so thick the world outside the window blurred, like someone had dragged a gray curtain across the neighborhood. The sound was constant, violent, relentless. Water striking rooftops, pavement, glass, metal, all at once. Within minutes, streets turned into streams. It didn't happen gradually, it happened all at once. Water rushed downhill following paths it remembered from decades ago, long before asphalt and storm drains tried to tell it where to go. Curbs disappeared. Road markings vanished beneath fast-moving brown water. Gutters overflowed almost immediately. I watched leaves, twigs, and trash spin helplessly at the mouths of drains that were never designed for this volume. Water surged over them and stayed, spreading outward, claiming lawns and sidewalks as if they'd always belonged to the river. And then the river responded. It surged against its banks like it had been waiting for this moment. The calm, decorative waterway everyone loved, the one featured in HOA brochures and listing photos, transformed into something else entirely. The surface churned. Debris slammed into the banks. Water clawed higher and higher, testing the edge, looking for weakness. I stood at my window and watched. Not in fear, not in panic, in focus. This was the scenario I had modeled. This was the convergence of saturation, runoff, and surge that the newsletters had dismissed. I could see it unfolding exactly the way the data said it would. Water rose. It crept across the lowest part of my yard first, pooling where the ground dipped just enough to collect it. The rain didn't let up. Every second added pressure. Every minute raised the stakes. The water line reached the base of the wall. It pressed against it, and then it stopped. Not dramatically, not with a splash. It simply held. The wall didn't fight the water. It redirected it, guiding the flow sideways, letting it pass without building destructive pressure. The drainage channels I had designed did their work quietly, efficiently, invisibly. The water line stabilized. I checked the time. I checked my sensors. I checked the levels again. Everything was performing exactly as intended. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood was experiencing something very different. I heard sirens. At first distant, muffled by the rain, easy to mistake for something farther away, then closer, then overlapping. Red and blue lights flashed through the rain like warnings written in color. Emergency vehicles moved slowly, cautiously, their tires pushing water aside as they passed. My phone vibrated. Once, twice, then continuously. HOA group alerts. Messages poured in faster than I could read them. Does anyone know what's happening near the office? My basement's taking on water. The street by the clubhouse is flooded. Power just went out near the entrance. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I zoomed in on the camera feed I had installed months earlier, pointing towards the lower end of the neighborhood. The image shook slightly in the wind, but it was clear enough. Water was moving fast, faster than people expected, faster than the infrastructure could handle. The road leading to the HOA office had become a channel, funneling runoff straight toward the building. The same design flaw I had warned them about for 2 years was now impossible to ignore. I imagined the inside of that office. The filing cabinets, the server racks, the neatly stacked boxes of records stored just inches above the floor. Water doesn't care about paperwork. Another alert buzzed in. Emergency board call happening now. Does anyone have sandbags? Who has the keys to the storage room? Confidence from the meeting earlier that day was gone, replaced by fragmented sentences and rising panic. Outside, the rain intensified again, if that was even possible. The river crested over its bank in one spot, spilling into a grassy area that led directly toward the parking lot. I watched as water crossed a line it had never crossed before. People were running now. Not fast, carefully, cautiously, but urgently. Headlights reflected off flooded pavement. A car stalled. Someone banged on a window. Another siren screamed. And through it all, my property remained still. The walls stood there,
partially submerged, unmoved. I stepped outside under the covered porch, rain misting in sideways. I could smell wet earth and river water, sharp and metallic. The air felt charged like the moment before something breaks. But nothing broke. Not here. I checked my foundation. Dry. I checked the basement sensors. Normal. I checked the pressure readings along the wall. Stable. My phone buzzed again. A message from the HOA president. Just one line. Are you experiencing flooding? I looked back toward the neighborhood office, now surrounded by water. I looked at my dry entryway. I looked at the wall they had laughed at. And for the first time that day, I replied, no.
The HOA office sat lower than my property. Bad design choice. It was one of those details that never mattered until suddenly it mattered more than anything else. When the neighborhood was planned decades ago, someone decided it would be convenient to place the administrative building near the entrance, tucked slightly below street level. Easier access, they said. Better visibility, they said. What they never accounted for was gravity. Water rushed down the street straight toward their building, accelerating as it went. The road curved just enough to guide the flow, turning pavement into a funnel. What began as runoff became a moving mass, carrying debris, trash, and pieces of landscaping with it. Their drainage system didn't stand a chance. Cheap materials, outdated design, years of deferred maintenance hidden behind optimistic inspection reports. The moment the water volume exceeded the system's limit, everything failed at once. Drains backed up, culverts choked, grates rattled, then vanished beneath swirling brown water. Within seconds, the pressure had nowhere left to go. Doors burst open under it, not dramatically, not like an explosion, but with a sudden, violent force that bent hinges and shattered seals. Water slammed into the lobby, spreading across tile floors in a fast, unstoppable wave. Water poured inside. It surged under desks, knocked over chairs, and swept loose items along with it like toys. File cabinets tipped, their contents spilling into the flood as paper turned heavy and translucent. Files floated. Decades of records, meeting minutes, contracts, violation notices, fine ledgers, lifted free from shelves and drifted aimlessly, ink bleeding into the water. Computers sparked. Someone tried to unplug a workstation and slipped, barely catching themselves on a door frame. A power strip hissed as water reached it, then snapped dark. Screens flickered, died, and went black. The hum of electronics was replaced by the sound of rushing water and rising panic. Furniture tipped over. A long conference table shifted, scraping loudly across the floor before floating just enough to knock into a wall. Office chairs spun in slow, useless circles. Filing cabinets leaned, then fell, splashing water high enough to soak framed mission statements and certificates mounted proudly just hours earlier. The same board members who had laughed at me were now ankle-deep in water. Their polished shoes disappeared first, then pant legs darkened as water climbed higher. Someone tried to roll up their cuffs, hands shaking too much to manage it properly. The laughter was gone. The confidence was gone. Voices overlapped, sharp and frantic. Where's maintenance? Why isn't it draining? Who approved this building design? The water didn't care about blame. It kept rising. Ankle-deep became knee-deep. Movement slowed as resistance increased. Each step sent ripples across the floor, sloshing water into outlets and under doors that had never been sealed for this kind of pressure. One board member slipped and went down hard, catching himself on a desk as water splashed up into his face. Another tried to wade toward the back room where the server rack was kept, only to stop short when he saw water pouring under the door. Then it reached waist deep. That's when fear turned into panic. Someone screamed, "Call emergency services!" Another voice yelled, "Shut off the power!" But no one knew where the breakers were. The maintenance binder, the one that supposedly contained emergency procedures, was floating somewhere near the ceiling, its pages peeling away. Phones were held high above heads now, voices cracking as people tried to explain the situation to dispatchers who were already overwhelmed with calls. "We're flooding! No! Rapidly! Yes! Inside! Yes! The whole building!" A loud crack echoed through the office as something heavy collided with the front glass. Water forced its way through a seam, widening it, sending another surge inside. Someone shouted to get out. Someone else froze. Too late. The water had already cut off the main exit. The parking lot outside was a shallow lake, headlights submerged, alarms wailing uselessly under the surface. They were trapped in the very structure they had insisted was perfectly safe. Meanwhile, rain continued to hammer down, relentless, indifferent. The river kept feeding the flow, pushing more water toward the lowest point it could find. Their point. I watched all of this from a distance, through cameras and updates and messages that grew more frantic by the minute. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation. This wasn't a surprise. This was a result of ignoring warnings, a result of prioritizing appearances over preparation, a result of mistaking authority for expertise. Eventually, emergency responders reached them, wading through water with flashlights and ropes. People were escorted out one by one, soaked, shaken, clutching phones and whatever dignity they could salvage. The HOA office was left behind, dark, flooded, ruined. By the time the rain finally eased, the damage was total. And somewhere in that muddy water, beneath floating papers and broken furniture, lay the fine they had issued me that morning, ink dissolved, paper pulp, meaningless. Because in the end, the only thing that mattered was this: when the water came, their confidence drowned, and the wall they called a joke was the only thing standing between chaos and control.
By morning, the damage was undeniable. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm itself. The neighborhood looked like it had been shaken and set back down carelessly. Mud coated the streets. Debris clung to fences. The river, finally retreating into its banks, left behind a mess that told a story no one could deny. The HOA office was destroyed. Not damaged, not inconvenienced, destroyed. The front doors hung crooked on their hinges, warped by pressure they were never designed to withstand. Inside, the water line was visible along the walls, an ugly brown stripe that marked how high the flood had climbed. The smell hit first: wet drywall, stagnant water, burnt electronics. Financial records? Ruined. Paper files that had survived decades of meetings, fines, disputes, and power struggles were now swollen and unreadable. Ink had bled into gray smears. Entire filing cabinets had rusted overnight, their contents fused together into useless blocks of pulp. Digital backups hadn't fared much better. Servers that were supposed to be secure had been installed just inches off the floor to save space and money. Water had reached them within minutes. Hard drives were fried. Databases corrupted. Years of transaction histories vanished in a single night. Insurance? Partially denied due to negligence. That detail spread quickly because it mattered more than anything else. The insurer's preliminary report cited multiple red flags: outdated drainage infrastructure, ignored maintenance recommendations, and failure to act on documented flood risk warnings. Coverage would apply to some structural damage, but not the losses tied directly to preventable failure. Preventable. That word appeared over and over again. Residents? Furious. They showed up in the parking lot that morning in groups, staring at the wreckage that represented their dues, their trust, their sense of security. Conversations grew louder by the hour as people compared notes. You knew about this? They ignored warnings? Our money was just sitting there? Some residents demanded emergency meetings. Others talked openly about lawsuits.
The community message boards exploded with screenshots of old newsletters, those same cheerful reassurances, now reading like cruel jokes. And my house? Dry, untouched, safe behind the wall they mocked. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While crews pumped water out of the HOA office and emergency tape cordoned off the area, my property looked exactly as it had the day before. No water stains, no foundation damage, no ruined belongings. Just a quiet wall doing exactly what it was built to do. When investigators arrived, they didn't ask about my wall. That surprised some people. A few residents assumed the city would question whether my construction had redirected water unfairly. A few board members, what was left of them, seemed to hope the blame could somehow be shifted. It couldn't. The investigators walked the site methodically. They measured elevations. They traced water paths. They reviewed drainage layouts and maintenance logs. Then they started asking questions. They asked why the HOA ignored repeated warnings. Emails surfaced, reports surfaced, diagrams surfaced. Not just from me either. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had raised concerns over the years. A contractor had flagged drainage capacity during a routine inspection. A previous consultant had recommended upgrades that were never funded. All of it had been filed away, deferred, forgotten. They asked why maintenance funds weren't used. That question cut deeper. Budgets were examined, reserve balances were reviewed, line items were scrutinized. It became painfully clear that money had been available, plenty of it, but had been allocated elsewhere. Cosmetic upgrades, landscaping refreshes, decorative lighting, projects that looked good in newsletters and annual reports. Critical infrastructure? Postponed, again and again. Then came the question no one wanted to answer. They asked why one homeowner had better flood protection than the entire board. There was no good response to that. The investigators weren't impressed by authority or titles. They were interested in responsibility, and responsibility had clearly been neglected. Within days, formal notices were issued, compliance reviews were scheduled, legal counsel for the HOA became involved, not to defend decisions, but to limit fallout. The board stopped sending emails, meetings were canceled, rumors spread that resignations were imminent. Residents organized on their own, independent committees formed, people demanded transparency, real transparency, not curated updates. And slowly, the narrative shifted. This was no longer about a flood. It was about trust. People realized that the same board that fined a homeowner for being fear-based had gambled with the entire community's safety. That the same voices who laughed in that meeting room had ignored real risk because acknowledging it would have required uncomfortable action. The fine they issued me was quietly rescinded. No announcement, no apology. Just removed from the ledger as if it never existed. But everyone remembered. Inspectors finished their reports. Insurance negotiations dragged on. Repair estimates climbed higher by the day. And through it all, my wall remained. No longer a joke, no longer controversial, just obvious. Neighbors stopped me while walking their dogs. Some asked questions, some just nodded. A few said, "I wish we'd listened." I didn't say much. There was nothing left to explain, because the evidence was everywhere, on the walls of the flooded office, in the soaked paperwork, in the angry voices of residents who finally understood what had been ignored. Preparation isn't paranoia, it's responsibility. And that morning made one thing painfully clear to everyone involved. When leadership fails, consequences don't ask for permission. They arrive anyway. A week later, the HOA president knocked on my door. I recognized the knock immediately, not the casual rhythm of a neighbor dropping by, not the firm tap of a delivery. This was hesitant, deliberate, someone rehearsing what to say on the other side. When I opened the door, he stood there, alone. No suit, no polished shoes, no confident posture. just a jacket pulled tight against the morning chill and a face that looked older than it had a week earlier. He didn't smile. He didn't extend a hand. He cleared his throat and said, "We may have underestimated you." The words hung there, waiting for something. Anger, satisfaction, forgiveness. I didn't respond. Because this was never about being right. It was about responsibility. I had never wanted an apology. I hadn't built the wall to embarrass anyone or prove a point. I built it because ignoring risk doesn't make it disappear, and hoping nothing goes wrong is not a plan. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. "The board has reviewed the situation," he continued. "Given everything that's happened, the fines related to your construction will be dropped." I nodded at once. That was all. He seemed surprised by how little reaction that earned. Perhaps he expected relief, or gratitude, or maybe even some acknowledgement of his authority returning. Instead, he just stood there, realizing, maybe for the first time, that the leverage he once enjoyed was gone. Within weeks, things began to change, quietly at first. The fine disappeared from the HOA records. No announcement, no explanation, just erased as if it had never existed. Then a board member resigned. Then another. Official statements cited personal reasons and time commitments, but no one believed them. Residents were paying attention now. They had read the investigation summaries. They had seen the insurance reports. They knew exactly where the failures had occurred. Within months, the entire board stepped down. A new interim committee was formed, this time with engineers, contractors, and residents who asked uncomfortable questions. The first agenda item wasn't landscaping. It wasn't signage. It wasn't community events. It was flood prevention. Suddenly, money that had been unavailable for years was found. Suddenly, drainage upgrades were urgent. Suddenly, the river wasn't just stable. Funny how panic changes priorities. What had been dismissed as paranoia became policy. What had been mocked became standard. Plans were drawn. Consultants, this time named, accountable, and challenged, were hired. Infrastructure upgrades began almost immediately. Real ones, expensive ones, necessary ones, and no one laughed anymore. Neighbors stopped me on walks. Some asked technical questions. Others just wanted to talk. A few admitted they had supported the board at first because it felt easier to trust authority than to confront risk. I didn't blame them. Trust is comfortable. Preparation is not. But comfort doesn't hold back water. Over time, the story of the flood became something people told new residents, not as gossip, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder that HOAs are made of people, and people make mistakes, especially when accountability feels distant. My wall remained where it was, no longer controversial, no longer criticized, just part of the landscape. So here's the lesson. If you live under an HOA that dismisses real risks, document everything. Emails, reports, conversations, meeting minutes. Save them. Organize them, because when something goes wrong, memories become selective, but documentation doesn't. Protect yourself, not emotionally, not defensively, practically. Follow the rules, know the codes, build responsibly. If you take action, do it in a way that can stand up to scrutiny, because preparation done right never needs to hide. And never let people who gamble with your home shame you for being prepared. Fear isn't the enemy. Negligence is. Hope isn't a strategy. Maintenance is. Because sometimes the joke isn't the wall. It's the people laughing right before the water comes in. If this story made you think differently about HOAs and preparedness, hit like. Subscribe for more real stories where planning beats power. And share this with someone who still thinks it'll never happen.